Welcome to Stop, Drop, and Scrutinize, what to do when you receive a government subpoena. Today we're going to talk to you in a lot of detail about how your approach and your response to a government subpoena can really impact the outcomes you have. I know it's tempting for a lot of folks to just say, hey, we don't have any problems with the government. We don't do anything wrong here at our company. And think that that means that you could just hand over all your documents, hand over your emails, and just take the government at its word. But actually, you actually have to take a cautious and careful approach in order to get a good outcomes. That's what we're going to discuss here today. Now, before we get into the weeds of this, there are some housekeeping matters, and my colleague Holly Campbell is going to be addressing those now.
Yeah, so just a few quick minutes of housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please let us know. We'd love to make this interactive and answer all the questions you have. So there's a Q&A widget on your screen. You can put questions in there and we'll answer them during the presentation. For questions that might require a more in-depth response, we will definitely reach out to you via email after the presentation. Happy to answer all of your questions. There's also a copy of today's slide deck in the resource widget on your screen. And we're all hoping we don't have any technical issues today, but if you do, there's a help widget on your screen as well. If you click that, you can get help with any technical issues. We're also presenting on video today, so to view that video presentation, just make sure your media player button is open to view the video presentation. Now, a very important part of the presentation, the CLE information. This webinar is accredited for 1 hour of general CLE in California, 1 hour of general CLE in Illinois, 1.2 hours of general CLE in Missouri, 1 hour of PPPM CLE credit in New York, and 1 hour of general CLE credit in Texas. Credit is awarded based on attendance for the entire 60 minutes. And based on some changes in jurisdictional requirements, we're no longer using automated pop-up attendance checks. Instead, we'll announce 2 secret words during the presentation, and you'll need to select that secret word from a multiple choice poll during the webinar, and we'll give you some time to do that when those come up. Please respond to both of those multiple choice polls to get your full CLE credit for today.
All right, now I'm going to briefly introduce myself and Holly. My name is Renato Mariotti. You can see the photo there of me before COVID, without the beard. I was a federal prosecutor for almost a decade, and in that role, I issued a heck of a lot of government subpoenas to a wide variety of entities, focused, on securities and commodities fraud primarily, but I investigated a wide variety of federal offenses, including healthcare fraud, and a wide variety of everything from real estate fraud, internet pharmaceutical sales, everything under the sun. Cyber attacks I investigated when I was a federal prosecutor, and so I have an experience of being on that side of things. And then for the last 6 years, been here at Thompson Coburn on the other end of government subpoenas, trying to negotiate with the government on behalf of clients to narrow the scope of subpoenas, to extend length of response times, but also to identify issues and respond to some of the thorny problems that are posed by government subpoenas. And then I'm joined by my colleague, Holly Campbell, and Holly has been working alongside with me for really almost the entire 6 years I've been in private practice. And she is really the nuts and bolts person handling a lot of government subpoena requests. So she has a lot of practical experience managing productions for government subpoenas, spotting issues in documents that we're producing to the government. She's in on all those negotiations with the government. Really, I think, has a broad understanding of this as well. So she'll be presenting this along with me. All right, so I'm going to talk now about why government subpoenas matter. I know that for a lot of you, this is like, okay, this is routine. Why do we even need to think about this? Do they really have anything to teach us about government subpoenas? We're going to answer those questions, deal with those issues here just right up front. So obviously, government subpoenas are never a positive thing. At the very least, you're going to have to waste some time, some resources responding to them. And I think a lot of people, when they get a subpoena from a government agency, whether it's the Justice Department or it's, the FDA or NHTSA or the CFTC, whoever it is, you're thinking, okay, this is just a burden. We're going to have to deal with this. But a lot of times, I think you don't really fully understand the potential downsides that can come when you receive a subpoena from the government. To me, they're a warning shot. They're something that should cause you not alarm, but some concern and a reason to make sure that you investigate further, right? If you heard a gunshot on your property, that may be nothing. That may be the neighbor kid with their BB gun, but it also could be a serious threat. It could be something that could be cause for alarm. You wouldn't just ignore the warning. All right. So here, one thing that I do think is an important point is that whenever you're dealing with federal regulators, serious liability is always on the table. And I think that we often fail to appreciate that when you're dealing with federal regulators, you're dealing with an entity that has a lot of potential to harm your business. An analogy I often use with my clients is, when we're thinking about, let's say, Russian hackers, there's no doubt in my mind that if the Russian intelligence service wanted to hack into our webinar today, that they could successfully pull that off. And I have no illusions that the firewalls and other protections on my Thomson Coburn laptop couldn't be thwarted by the Russian intelligence service. How is it that my laptop has been safe from the Russian hackers? Well, it's because I'm of no interest to them. I'm not on their radar screen. I'm not somebody that, foreign intelligence services are trying to infiltrate. Well, the similar thing is true with government regulators. The fact of the matter is that if you had federal investigators crawling throughout your business, it wouldn't be surprising to me if they found some technical violation of some federal law. And certainly that investigation would potentially pose very serious issues, concerns, costs, and so on you. The most important way that all of us avoid all of those costs, avoid those concerns, avoid that liability, is by staying off the radar screen of regulators, because they trust that, we are not doing anything that is problematic that brings us within their gaze. Whenever you're being looked at, even if it's part of somebody else's inquiry, in other words, your competitor is being investigated, your supplier is being investigated, your customer is being investigated, if you are within the orbit, within the gaze of a federal investigator, you have to be concerned. Or a state investigator, that I keep using the term federal, a state investigator as well. If the state attorney general is looking at a particular industry and you're in that industry or have a lot of business relationships with that industry, that can be a cause for concern as well. And you have to react to that appropriately. So what you don't know on the front end is, for example, when you receive a subpoena, you don't know why the government has issued it to you. Now, I know a lot of times we'll look at the face of the subpoena and we will try to deduce from that what the government's purpose is. And sometimes there are important clues there. If all of, for example, the items in the subpoena are asking for records related to a supplier, I think it's fair to say that the government's really interested in that supplier. That doesn't mean they're not interested in you too. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be potential liability for your company, but it certainly means that the focal point, or at least a focal point of the investigation, is the supplier. You don't know also what's going to happen next. I mean, sometimes you'll have one subpoena that'll come from the government, but then there might be an interview request around the corner. Or it may be that there's information that they learned through the documents that they came from you that cause additional concerns. And I will also say that, one of the most important things that we do, if I had to say, when I look at how Holly and I respond to government subpoenas, where we can provide the most value for clients is that when we talk to the government on your behalf, so let's just say that you hired us and we were talking to the government. We spend a lot of our professional lives talking to government investigators. That's what we do. We understand not only their language and how they talk, but we also understand when they're not saying things. And the bullet point here is just so important. What the government doesn't say can be important is what it does say. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. If I ask the government and say, okay, is my client the target of your investigation? They may say no. But and that's great, but it gives very limited comfort, because a target is very narrowly defined generally by federal agencies, for example. And so the fact that your company isn't the target or isn't yet the target of the investigation may not mean all that much. But if I ask them for details about their investigation, if I try to get an understanding of exactly what they're looking at, and they fail to provide context, if they're very guarded, if they're unwilling to say more, if they're unwilling when I ask for certain insurances, or I ask them, probing questions, if I don't get certain responses from them, that silence will tell me that they have not ruled out that my client could have liability, that they have concerns potentially about certain practices that my client has, or my client's relationship with an entity that they are investigating. So I can often provide value to my clients by helping them interpret, the tea leaves or the coffee grounds, so to speak, that I'm getting from the government. And that, I will just say that information that I provide you from that conversation can very much help you get ahead of enforcement authorities. That can provide a lot of value to your business. If there is a government investigation of your industry, for example, let's say you're in healthcare and pharmacies are being targeted, and you're a pharmacy, that knowledge of what the government is looking for, what the practice is in question on the front end can help you run the issues down, understand your own practices, and then take corrective action before the government gets to the point where they're interviewing your employees.
All right. Now that we've talked about the overall issue of why subpoenas matter when they receive them, I'm going to focus on a few of the practical first step issues to think about when your company first receives a subpoena. So the first thing to think about is that government often sets very unreasonable deadlines in their subpoenas. We've seen them with generally less than 30 days to respond, but sometimes only 2 or 3 weeks to respond. And by the time that subpoena works its way up through the company to the right person, you may see that you only have days left before that deadline that your company is supposed to respond to the subpoena. And Renato mentioned he issued a lot of these subpoenas while he was in government, and has mentioned that that short deadline given in the subpoena can often be a deliberate strategy on the part of the government. They may set a short deadline and not necessarily expect a response by that deadline, but by putting that short deadline in the subpoena, the government can make sure that the subpoena is quickly bubbled up to someone in the company or counsel who will reach out to the government and start those discussions with them about the subpoena. So putting a longer deadline may delay those initial discussions between the government and company or counsel. So it is important to keep in mind that these deadlines are negotiable, and we can reach out and request additional time. We can also negotiate with the government to get approval to produce documents on a rolling basis, meaning not collecting and producing everything at once, but producing batches of documents over a longer period of time. And the benefit to getting government agreement on a rolling production is really that all of your companies have kind of low-hanging fruit documents that are easy to collect and get together, and maybe are simple documents that don't require a ton of review or look at a lot of issues, and you can easily turn those over while having more time to collect and review documents that may be more questionable or could have implications for liability, where you want more time to talk to employees, get an understanding of the documents, get context about those documents, and really just have time to make a strategic decision about whether to provide that context to the government when you produce those documents. So either having a call with the government before that batch where there may be some emails that look bad on their face, but there's an explanation for, you can provide that context to the government, or along with the production when you produce that batch. Another kind of first step in the process of responding to a subpoena that we do is work on narrowing the scope of the subpoena. So the government often starts with very broad requests for information. And this can be especially true if your company is receiving a subpoena at the beginning stages of the government investigation. So you're embedded with your businesses, you understand the industry you're working in and your business in a lot of detail, but a lot of companies are surprised when they receive subpoenas about how little the government attorneys investigating know about that industry or your business. So because the government attorney drafting the subpoena may not have this kind of expertise or deep understanding of the industry, oftentimes they'll draft very broad requests to make sure they capture everything that might be relevant down the road as they continue their investigation and learn more about kind of what types of communications, what documents may be housed by businesses in the industry they're investigating. So really, in terms of narrowing the scope of the requests, a lot of our job can be educating the government about what types of records there may be in the industry, who communicates with whom, and things like that, to try to really narrow down the scope of what is being requested. And not to throw Renato under the bus, but he's also mentioned from his time in government that those super broad requests can also be a deliberate strategy. Government can put out broad requests and then negotiate them down with counsel for the company. But then if they don't receive all the documents they need, they can ask for more, relying on the broad requests in the initial subpoena without having to issue a new subpoena to the company. And that can be a leverage point for the government. Now, another way we work to narrow the scope and the burden of subpoenas is negotiating with the government on search terms or custodians. So narrowing by custodians can be really critical, especially for large companies. If you have hundreds of thousands of employees across the globe, obviously collecting all of their emails is going to be time and cost prohibitive. So what we can do is actually identify a list of custodians with the government and get their approval on that custodian list for the production. When doing that, though, the custodian list does need to be a defensible group. You can't just pick 3 people and say, we'll check these 3 people's emails. You want to make sure on the front end to interview employees and collect enough information to know who the key players or who would have responsive information about the topic the government's looking for. Something you definitely don't want to happen is you turn over your documents, you had your custodian list, and an employee goes in for an interview and they say, Sally was the main person who worked with that vendor that the government's investigating. But if Sally wasn't on your custodian list, the government's going to have a lot of questions for why she wasn't, if she was this key person in this relationship, and you may have to go back and recollect and reproduce her emails. So one thing we do is work with you to get a sense of a defensible custodian list that covers everyone that will be relevant in the investigation, but brings down the burden of trying to search all of your employees' communications. Another important aspect of narrowing the scope of the subpoena is working with you to understand what categories of the subpoena are most burdensome for your company to produce and to focus on narrowing those specific excuse me, categories of documents. So when we look at a subpoena, we may think certain categories are easy for your company to collect, but then when talking with you, we may get an understanding that those documents are housed in multiple different places and are more difficult to collect. So we move those categories of documents to later productions in the rolling production. And then one other aspect of first things to focus on that I wanted to mention that is not on this slide is document holds. So document holds are critical whenever your company receives a subpoena. We can work with your company to craft those document holds so that they meet the specifications of the subpoena. And also work with you to make sure to turn off any sort of auto delete, any automatic document destruction policies or programs at your company. Because again, what you don't want is employee going in saying, oh yeah, I wrote a memo about that main subject 3 years ago. But you know, we must not have it anymore because of our document retention policy. It's definitely not where you want to be with the government. So putting those holds in place as soon as the subpoena is received is definitely very important.
Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking right now. I can read your mind through this webinar, which is my company's done nothing wrong. In my company, you know, maybe at these other companies, maybe all these other people on the webinar are wrongdoers who break the law all the time, but not at my company. We don't really get in trouble. We don't do anything wrong. We always follow the rules. And so there's no issue here. I've wasted my time by watching the webinar, and you're wrong. And the reason why, and I alluded to this earlier, is even if your company has done nothing wrong, the government could be looking at your customers, they could be looking at your supplier, they could be looking at a competitor, and that could have profound implications for your business, both positive and negative, potentially. But the important thing is you don't want to be flying blind. You want to understand what those implications are. So a government investigation could actually have strategic implications for your company. And for example, let's say that your company is using a supplier or a vendor that is under government investigation. It could be during the course of complying with the government subpoena and the ensuing government investigation, you learn facts about that about that party and what's going on, that supplier, that causes your company to want to reevaluate your relationship with that supplier. Because, you know, having a supplier that, let's say, is dishonest or that is doing something that, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, is going to entail a lot of scrutiny from the government, that getting involved in that may be bad for your business. It may impose additional costs that may make it more beneficial for your company to use a different supplier in the future. Similarly, you might want to reevaluate how you communicate with that party that's under investigation. So, for example, it's very frequent. It's a very frequent thing for us on a regular basis to work with clients who are responding to subpoenas that are really directed to where the thrust of the investigation is directed towards someone else, but it changes how our client deals with that other party. So, for example, you know, we had a case recently where the CEO of our client was communicating verbally with this entity that's under investigation. And that, I think you don't need me to tell you that that's not where you want to be if you want to avoid having your CEO be a government witness. Because anything that's verbal is something that he would have to recount in sworn testimony versus something that is in an email, right, or something that is written down in some fashion. So certainly just the form of communication itself could be important, and if you don't respond in a more in a more active and thoughtful way towards the government subpoena, you may not get the information you need to make that adjustment. But forgetting even the form, sometimes what you say to a party that's under investigation can be important. So if you know that, for example, your customer is deliberately placing orders in one quarter and trying to convince your employees to delay shipments to a different quarter or vice versa, and you know that the government is concerned about this practice, how you communicate with that customer could be very important. What you say could be important. You may want to have some communications training, or you may want to have some guidance that's given to those employees that are dealing with that entity to ensure that whatever issues that the entity has are separate and apart from your company's. And also, of course, who communicates to the party under investigation can be very important. So, for example, if you have a competitor that's under investigation, or let's just say there's a business partner that's under investigation, and you have a contract that's being negotiated, a business deal that's being negotiated, the individuals that you select to undertake that investigation may become witnesses in this ongoing investigation. And so you can be thoughtful about who is the one that's going to be going to this negotiation with the competitor that's under investigation, or who is going to be handling our routine communications with the supplier. You want it to be the sort of person that you don't mind sitting with the government, talking to them and answering their questions, or sitting in a conference room with me, or over a Zoom with me preparing for their testimony. So you can be thoughtful and prepare for the government investigation and how it's going to impact you if you understand what the government is investigating, and use your response to the subpoena as a tool to learn more so that your company can take steps to reduce the potential cost, burden, inconvenience, or potential liability that comes with this government investigation. The other thing I think that's important that we have to think about is that revealing a subpoena can also reveal the potential liability of individuals at a company, right? We all know that obviously, your company and its interests stand separate and apart from any employee of the company, including an officer, including a C-suite officer of the company, including a director, right? No matter who those individuals are, the company ultimately stands separate from that. And so if, for example, the government is investigating potential activity by your CFO, or let's say there's a board member that's under investigation, that is, it's very important to identify that as soon as possible so that you can take corrective action and make sure that whatever liability is being caused by that particular individual is not, taken on by the company. So, for example, that often involves interviewing those employees. Sometimes it involves finding separate counsel for those individuals. But you want to be able to do that before the government gets all the documents it'll need to move forward aggressively in its investigation. If your CFO did do something that was problematic, you'd rather know before the government does about those problematic communications or entries in your books and records, or whatever it may be, so that you can take corrective action, so that you can message to your shareholders, you could message to, for example, lenders, whoever it may be that you have the issue with, so that you can get out, that you can get ahead of the government investigation. And I think sometimes, ironically, I would say the government investigation can often spur you to take your own investigation. I'm not talking about anything. Sometimes it can be very formal, but sometimes it can merely be looking into a matter. But let's just say, for example, that in the course of producing documents to the government or gathering documents for the government, you find out that there is somebody at your company. Let's say the director of sales is involved in wrongdoing. It's very important for you when there is somebody who's involved in wrongdoing that you kind of draw a circle around that person, right? It's like if you have cancer, you need to cut around the tumor, make sure the entire tumor's out, make sure all the cancer's out. You don't want to leave anything behind. And so if, for example, that director of sales has an assistant who's been helping him with it, who has others at the company who know about the wrongful activity but have been hiding it or have been helping him keep it silent, you want to make sure you know about that so that you can take whatever corrective action is necessary. That may mean sometimes actually distancing the company from those employees. It may be telling the government, for example, that, we have, you've asked us for all these documents. We've discovered this issue by employees A and B. We've looked into the matter, and you should know we have terminated employees A and B. And their actions violated certain written policies we have. And, we've investigated and run down the issue. We found that no one else was helping them, or we found that individual C, had a certain role, and you can set that forward for the government. Now, I mentioned earlier interviewing relevant employees. That's something that Holly and I do all the time in matters that come from or spawned off of these government subpoenas. Because what we'll do is we can have a conversation as counsel for the company and give what's called an upjohn warning, which basically tells those employees that we represent the company, we don't represent them, and that the company holds the privilege over the conversation, and the company can decide to waive privilege. In that circumstance, we can actually provide something of value to you because we'll have an interview and Holly will write up a memo, and we can have something that, if necessary, we can actually provide to the government, if that's something that is in your interest to do, and tell the government, look, we've looked into this matter. We've interviewed the employees. We know the extent of what happened, and here you go. Here is an interview memo that we are providing you. We're waiving the privilege with respect to conversations with this particular employee, providing this to you, and we're available. I'm sure Holly would prefer not to, but Holly would be available to testify. And we've done this before, where we tell the government we're ready and able to testify if needed to help them, with their investigation of a particular employee's misconduct. The important thing there is, as you can see, distancing the company from this activity, for making sure that the government investigation is behind our own investigation, and then our questions for those employees will actually be from the company's perspective, right? Because we represent you. What will happen is our questions of that employee will make sure that we establish, for example, that the company doesn't have liability to the extent that that's consistent with the facts. And that's something that we'll do better than the government, because the government doesn't care. They don't have that interest necessarily in establishing and a distance between yourself and your employee in the way that we do. So we'll be able to develop those lines of questions, and we might actually be able to get the employee to be more cooperative than the government would. The other thing that I think, and then just the bottom line here, which I think goes unsaid, and why we do all of this, is that the actions of an employee can sometimes generate liability for the company. Sometimes the government will hold you responsible. Sometimes, though, it can generate civil liability, or there can be additional sort of attendant costs that come with the liability that the employee has. So it's important to make sure that when there is a potential wrongdoing by an individual, that you handle it appropriately and thoughtfully.
All right, and now we have our first secret word of the day. The first secret word is baseball. Please select baseball from the multiple on your screen. And we'll give everyone a minute to select the secret word, which is baseball. Give everyone a little more time. Again, the secret word is baseball. All right, it looks like we are good to move on. So now we're going to walk through two examples of two different companies' responses to receiving a subpoena. And I think you'll see pretty quickly that one of these follows kind of the deliberate, thoughtful path we've been talking about, and another does not. So hope you'll be able to see which is which pretty quickly, but we'll walk through each of those. So in this first example, our company here receives a subpoena from the SEC. And they look at the face of the subpoena, and all of their requests seem to be focused on one of their suppliers. They ask for a lot of communications with this supplier, invoices from the supplier, payments made to the supplier, contracts with the supplier. So they receive the subpoena and think the investigation must be about this supplier. We don't need to worry. And the deadline in the subpoena is coming up, so they scramble to collect all of the documents requested in the subpoena. Don't discuss the scope of the subpoena with the government, but just go ahead and have IT pull everything that could be relevant, pull it together, hundreds of thousands of documents, and turn it over to the government without reviewing those documents first. After they've turned over the documents, months and months pass with no response from the government. And this is actually really common in the cases we see, especially with, we hear about budget constraints at some of these regulatory agencies. They could be reviewing those hundreds of thousands of documents you turned over for months. You may not even hear from them for years. So while those months and months pass with no communications from the government, the company assumes that the SEC's investigation was done, must not have found anything, and the government must have moved on. Now, more than a year later, this company receives a subpoena for testimony for its employees. Now, at that point, the company has turned over hundreds of thousands of documents without looking at them. So they don't know what information the government has, what the government's interested in. They're already behind where the government's investigation is at. So at this point, they have to scramble, hire counsel. That counsel will need time to review those many, many documents that were pulled and turned over and to get up to speed on the case. And once they review those documents, like the new counsels come in, they discover that actually those emails they turned over to the government show that certain employees were receiving kickbacks from the supplier to route deliveries to help it hit its quarterly goals. So even though when you first received the subpoena, it looked like the focus was on the supplier and your company wasn't involved, you actually received this subpoena because your employees were receiving kickbacks from that supplier. And that's why the supplier's name was in the subpoena so much. And then once this discovery is made, say another whoops, then you see that after you turned over documents in response to the first subpoena, employees within your company trade messages about how to cover their tracks from these kickbacks that they were receiving. And now the government has issued you a second subpoena, and those communications, because you haven't interviewed employees, communicated with employees, those post-subpoena messages are out there and the government will see those coming up. And then once the government has to talk to these employees, we have another whoops. They talk about a document, a key document. The SEC asks you to go back and produce that document to them. But at the beginning of this investigation, we didn't put a document hold policy in place. So again, that document has been deleted. I think this overall is one scenario where we don't want any of your companies to be ever in this position responding to subpoenas. So take that as the warning message of which side not to be on.
All right. So I have the easier job of helping you see how this would um, go differently, how you get on a totally different path if you handle this in the sort of active, proactive fashion that we've talked about throughout this presentation. The goal of this is to help you see concretely how some of the measures that we talked about previously in practice is going to generate a different result. Obviously, what Holly talked about a second ago, you could say it's exaggerated. It was basically if you did all the wrong things. And I just will say before we get into this, you may be thinking to yourself, I would never do that. And I will just tell you that we do have clients who hire us and say, yeah, we just produced all these documents because they said they were focused on somebody else. Or, yeah, we didn't really look into this because they weren't, they weren't, we weren't the target, or, we didn't think it was that big of a deal. They were only asking for a few documents. It didn't seem like that big of a deal. And we end up in a situation where we're playing catch up and actually, it takes more resources to try to do something quickly after the fact and try to catch up to where the government is rather than get ahead. So how can you avoid that? How are you going to be in a better situation? Well, let's say the same company got that same subpoena from the SEC that really referenced that supplier, where the supplier is, mentioned throughout the subpoena. If instead that company then hired counsel and negotiated a lengthy response time, let's say they can respond over the course of 180 days to that subpoena in batches, well, that basically gives the company 180 days to get on top of the issue. And there may be extensions and so on later on, right? So in the course of that lengthy time period, then the company can collect and review documents, and now they can discover up front, before the documents are produced to the government, that certain employees are receiving kickbacks from the supplier. In that circumstance, if you are in the course of reviewing those documents, you're going to have not only you're going to have the document hold in place that Holly mentioned, so they're not you're going to have whatever emails come in the wake of this, but you can take action before the employees rope in others or take further steps. What you can do is interview those employees up front, give them the upjohn warning, take whatever action you want to take. Let's say in this hypothetical, the employees are all fired. And then when you approach the SEC, you're totally in a different situation. Instead of waiting for the SEC, a year later, the SEC comes back and they say, you've got a big problem. Instead, before you produce these documents to the SEC that reveal that your employees are taking kickbacks from the supplier, you could tell the SEC, we're going to produce the third batch of documents on Friday, but let's talk on Thursday. And during that conversation, you can tell them that during the course of the review of that batch of documents, you discovered that these, two lone employees were engaged in this activity. You can explain to the SEC that this was done without the knowledge of the company, that as soon as the company found this out in the course of this review, that the company immediately looked into the matter, took appropriate action, terminated the employees, has new policies or checks or other practices to make sure that this never happens again, education perhaps for employees. And you can, hand over to the SEC interviews or other facts that you uncovered in your investigation. And the SEC loves this. This isn't just good for your company. The SEC likes it because you've saved them a lot of time and effort. By getting ahead of the matter, instead of the SEC attorney having to do all this work themselves over the course of a year to try to figure out what happened and piece it together, you can give them this issue with a bow wrapped on it and say, here you go, I've done all the work, and they can run with it from there and take whatever action. They're happy with your company, and more importantly, your company can get ahead of these issues and reduce your liability and also help you get this matter behind you. Ironically, sometimes by taking an approach where you're more passive, you can actually impose not only more costs, but you can make it so that you have to deal with the government more and for a lengthier period of time.
We have our second secret word of the day now. The second secret word is lunch. Please select lunch from the multiple choice poll below. We'll give everyone a little bit of time to select lunch from the word poll below. And again, that secret word is lunch. Give everyone just a few more seconds. All right, looks like we are good to move on.
All right. I do want to talk a little bit about strategic considerations, or maybe a lot. I think this is an important thing to go over. A lot of you that are listening today are in the legal department of a company. And I know from all of my conversations with friends that are in-house and in clients that a lot of times the rest of the business can actually think of you guys as like a cost center, right? Like the legal department's just a cost center. They don't generate profits like we do. They just spend money and we've got to tightly control their budgets. But I think that one thing that can be missed is that government investigations actually provide a circumstance where you as a legal department can provide value to the business side, where you in the legal department can actually, help the business side, the other side of your business, the business side actually, provide value, potentially generate, a better outcome for the business. And this is particularly the case when a key partner or a competitor or an antagonist or a customer or a supplier is the focus of the government investigation, because that can really have strategic implications for a company. Now, the example I put here is where the government is investigating a competitor, which could impact how aggressively you pursue a particular opportunity. So, for example, let's just say that the FTC or the DOJ is investigating a competitor. The knowledge that we can give to you about what we're seeing in the government's investigation, which, by the way, isn't directed at you, but of course, you and your employees may be providing evidence in connection with, testimony in connection with, that can feed into your business, and you can make a decision that that you want to pursue a particular opportunity that before you had this information, you may not want to pursue, simply because you know that perhaps the competitor is going to be careful about being accused in this acquisition of monopolization, let's just say, in this particular hypothetical example. Similarly, that can be the case if you have a partner. You can make a decision if that partner that you have is under investigation. That can change the nature of the partnership that you go into. If you're about to negotiate the renewal of a partnership with an entity that's under the microscope of our federal investigators, you may decide, how we structure this partnership is different, or how deep we want to get with this partner, how much we want to invest in this partnership is changed. And the same thing can be true with a customer or a supplier. You could ultimately make the decision that it may be better to go in a different direction with a customer or supplier. It could mean that, for example, in the negotiation of an agreement with that entity, that you may have provisions in there that are going to be responsive to whatever the government's concerns are. In other words, you may have a situation where the government believes that you are being pressured by your partner or by a customer or a vendor to engage in certain practices. So you may want to deal with that in the course of the agreement. That's something that you may want to actually, deal with specifically, not only to avoid liability, but also sometimes you can get a strategic advantage. If you know that the government believes that the entity on the other side of the table is pressuring you or doing something unlawful in the government's mind, you might put them in a situation where you can actually be more aggressive in a negotiation, recognizing that one of two things is going to occur. Either they're going to be cautious in the wake of increased scrutiny in their questionable practices, or they're going to act and potentially get themselves in a situation where the government may take some action. The point is that having more information always helps a company in any negotiation, make any decision, and so on. And we don't always think of what we're doing when responding to a subpoena as something that could actually provide value, but it really can, because by providing additional insight into not only what the government's doing, but how that is impacting a competitor, a partner, a supplier, a customer, that can really be provide a situation where we can change our own practices. And sometimes, and I alluded to this earlier, that may actually result in you severing a relationship. We've had that happen with clients where clients have decided, not worth working with this customer anymore. It's very limited upside, very small dollar amount. Better to just not incur the potential exposure or expense of dealing with them. Sometimes it's changing how you communicate or who does the communication. There have been times where clients make a decision that they want to have certain individuals involved in the negotiation of the renewal of an agreement once they realize that the government's going to be heavily scrutinizing that agreement, because they'd rather not have certain individuals testifying, just so that those individuals can have more time to pursue the real primary goal, which is to make sure the business is successful, right? So that's something we are always eager on our end to try to find ways to create value for our clients, and that's something that we can do that actually can, for you in the legal department, enable you to walk down the hall and say, look, here's something we're doing that actually is going to provide value for the business, as opposed to being something that is merely a cost or is merely taking value away.
All right, and we'll just talk about one last piece of the response to receiving a subpoena quickly, and that's reputation management. So I think we've all seen these stories in the news, sports teams, multinational companies. News breaks about an investigation by the SEC or FTC that uncovered wrongdoing at the company. And in a position you don't want to be is you want to be ahead of that when that news breaks or when the SEC's press release comes out. You want to be ahead of that so that you can take corrective action if there is wrongdoing by one of your employees. Even if your company is not liable, seeing this news or press release about a government investigation may cause a lot of concerns. It may cause concerns with shareholders, business partners, lenders, and you may have to determine whether you need to make any required disclosures to shareholders or the board of your company. But one place you don't want to be is for that news to break and that employee who engaged in wrongdoing, let's say, is still the CEO of the company or still in the C-suite, and you haven't taken any corrective action before that news breaks. So going through this process, this proactive process we discussed today, by really getting extra time to respond and having time to interview employees and really get to the bottom of what the government is looking at before you turn over documents to the government and before that information is generally released to the public, that can help you stay ahead of kind of the news story. And you could say, look, we took action. This was a individual employee that was engaged in wrongdoing. They've been terminated, and that will look better for your company than them still being in that position when the news breaks. And an investigation into a supplier, one of your vendors, can also impact how you publicly use that your relationship with that. So say, for example, your company is starting to put out a new product and they've created a partnership with a supplier who's going to help you create that new product. So you go out and you have your presentation to investors, and you have your big logo right next to the supplier's logo on your slide deck. Well, once you receive the government subpoena and see that they're subject, you may rethink how your company is presenting that partnership, not only to the public, but to investors, others, business. So, excuse me. This type of proactive approach can, with the subpoena and getting time to respond, provide more time, in addition to interviewing employees, getting to the bottom of the issue, to work with your media relations team, your outside PR consultants, and again, get ahead of those press releases, those news breaks before they come out. And turn it back over to Renato for...
Yeah, brief wrap up here. What I want to say, and by the way, you could tell we're very much on time. We were trying to provide you the full hour of CLE, but not keeping you even a minute over. We've really timed this as carefully as possible as a result. One thing I will just say in response to some of the questions that we've been getting here, which we have monitored, and we will get back to some of you individually, including about the secret word and all that. I saw the questions about that as well. Is just that obviously this is not a one size fits all. The bottom line that we were trying to get across here is that obviously every situation is different. But if you just regard this government subpoena as a chore that you need to get off your desk, and you're trying to get it off your desk as fast as possible, you actually are going to potentially not only lose value you can provide, which I think can be important, but you're also just dealing with a dangerous entity in a way that doesn't exercise care. And if you had something that was poisonous in your house, you wouldn't just let it out or something like that. You would actually handle that very carefully. And this is really the same sort of situation. You want to handle the situation as carefully as possible. So, I will just say that, the bottom line here is that by taking a careful approach and getting out ahead of the government, the real main goal here is simply to get out in front of the government so that this way you can find out about the issues, you can take corrective action. And now I know a lot of you, may wonder exactly how that works in practice. We're happy to interface with you and talk to you and address some of those questions. All I would really ask is that if you do that, just reach out to us. We're going to be available to you afterward. And we can avoid situations. I know Holly alluded to, for example, to these companies that there have been a lot of bad news reports lately. There had been a accounting firm, for example, just this week that had employees that were, cheating on ethics exams, and that became such an issue. Now, one question I did get that I do also want to address right before we go is, are there privilege issues that may come up if you are just handling this matter internally? How do we handle matters of privilege versus going to outside counsel? And the only thing I would just say there is if you are handling matters internally, first of all, remember, if you look into a matter yourself, you may end up being the witness. So keep that in mind. So if you're the one interviewing employees accused of wrongdoing, you're putting yourself potentially in the witness chair. I don't know if you want to do that. But separate and apart from that, the government can always consider that all of you are potentially, wearing two different hats. And you don't want to have a situation where the government thinks that, for example, when you are speaking to an employee, you're doing it with a business hat on rather than a legal hat. Having outside counsel deal with those issues can ensure that you're dealing with someone who will, definitely hold privilege, and it's harder for the government to argue that there's no privilege on those conversations. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was helpful to you, and please continue to follow up if you have any questions.